Hi everybody and welcome to this video about bishop b5 check, bishop d7 Sicilian. This is going to be the last line that we have to cover to complete our bishop b5 check and bishop b5 Rosolimo oriented repertoire, and it's arguably the most solid line at black's disposal. I think a lot of people struggle to play against this line. Most people have the impression it's very drawish and a little bit boring, but I truly think that white is able to fight for an advantage in this line. So let's see. First of all, white should probably take on d7 over here. People have been trying to move c4 and occasionally a4, but they're just not that amazing in my opinion, so we should start with taking. Black usually opts for queen takes, although we will have a look at knight takes d7 later on. And here the famous line that a lot of people consider to be very drawish goes short castle, knight f6, rook e1, knight c6, c3, e6, d4, and it looks like white achieved something by speeding up his development. He now managed to get the center very quickly, but black strikes back pretty much immediately after taking d5, and it turns out that there's very little that white can hope for in this line. The line continues something like e5, knight e4, and after knight d2 takes bishop to e7. Even though some players try to squeeze something out of this position, out of the slight space advantage, it really is a very successful sort of French position. It resembles a French advanced variation in which we no longer have the somewhat misplaced bishop on c8. So this is absolutely not the direction that I want to take as white, and I've never tried this line. My repertoire fully focuses on the move c4. Now c4 is also a move that a lot of people know, but think is not very good because of some tactical lines, and we'll be looking at those tactical lines shortly. But first of all, what is the idea of c4? We want to set up a structure which is called the so-called Maroczy structure, which is signified by the pawns on c4 and e4, and later on we're going to play d4 as indicated by the arrows. The main line over here is knight f6, knight c3, g6. We will be looking at some other options for black in the next video, but this is probably the most important line and the one that white struggles with. And here we go, d4 takes, knight takes. Now this would be a typical Maroczy position if it's not for the fact that the light square bishops have already been exchanged. What's sort of the general plan for both sides here? Well, white tries to hold on to his space advantage, and he does so by playing slow moves like b3, f3, putting his rook to the center and probably the bishop on e3, and then slowly but surely squeeze black's position into something that could become very uncomfortable if black doesn't have the option of creating counterplay. That counterplay usually comes from either the move b5 or e6, d5. So it's those two pawn breaks that we're going to have to be looking at when we're playing these lines. A lot of games here already kind of go wrong because people castle as white, which looks like a very natural move but actually runs into a pretty famous trick. After the move f3, planning to do exactly what I previously described, black now has a famous line that he could go for, which is rook c8, hitting on the c4 pawn and pretty much forcing b3. And now there's this move d5. After the sequence e takes d5, knight takes d5, we see that we can't really take with the pawn because the knight would be hanging and black would get a good position. So knight takes d5, e6, and we see that black earns back the piece, and after going e takes d5 on the next move, his position is basically equal. So this is how a lot of games ended, and still sometimes people make draws like this, but it's absolutely not the way that white can fight for an advantage. So already at this point you have to realize that white has an important decision to make. And the best move in my opinion is f3. Other moves have been tried too. These include, for example, h3, which is actually a legitimate try for an advantage. It's just that most people don't like to play with h3 rather than f3, but might be one of the moves to consider if you want to expand on your repertoire here. And also I believe the move knight e2 has been tried, although it does give black options with queen e6 later, if I'm not mistaken, either castle knight e2 or knight e2 immediately. The best move in my opinion though is f3, and the idea is simple. After black castles, bishop to e3, we no longer have to deal with this idea of rook c8, b3 and d5. It simply doesn't work because our knight on d4 is now protected. So just to double check the same line, we can now simply retreat our knight to, for example, c3, and we're piece up. So that equalization, that line leading to a forced draw is no longer there, and it's the start of a very complicated middle game position. But before going there, I would like to briefly address one of the other lines that Black could go for, which is actually a line that Vishy Anand has tried against Magnus Carlsen, which is the move queen to c7. It's quite a concrete way to deal with this. We basically have to go for b3, and after queen a5, we're dealing with a slightly awkward situation, as Magnus Carlsen here decided to play bishop to b2, knight c6, and here we're seeing that there's pretty serious pressure along the diagonal. So after castle, he couldn't really make anything normal work over here because knight takes e4 types of ideas are threatening, and knight ce2 was placed. Now he played a very nice game and he managed to win. But I would like to propose a slight improvement on this game by going queen to d3 here, and it's actually an idea that we will see a lot more in the lines that I'm going to show you in the main line. This move queen d3 tends to be very useful. Not only does it defend the knight, obviously in this case, it also prevents future plans with a6 b5, and it's generally a good square for the queen. You might think that it could come under attack quite easily, which as we can see over here is the case. But as long as you can get some sort of harmonious setup, as we do now, it's not really that big of a deal. And it's always the question whether the knight going to e5 or c5 is really a gain of a tempo or just a move on Black's side that, you know, can also turn out to be not so not so good, because the knights can be kicked out later. For example, in this case, a3, b4 could happen in the future. So this position over here, I think, is actually a little bit more comfortable than the game, and that's the first improvement I would like to suggest. Now let's go to the main position, which is after short castle, bishop to e3. And here Black has two major moves at his disposal. The first one is rook c8 anyway, and after b3, a6. We once again see the same idea appear. I think the move queen to d3 here serves pretty much White's purpose because we're preventing b5 in a rather active way. For the moment, d5 is also still not possible. So after something like knight c6 castle, it really doesn't make all that much sense now for Black to go e6 d5 because the rooks can't really support that break. So most likely Black will play something like queen d8, maybe with the idea of regrouping with knight d7 and queen a5. And here I like the move knight takes c6. Knight takes c6 is another move that I think you should familiarize yourself with, because very often it's a common idea to exchange one pair of knights on c6 when Black has played a6. The main reason is that after b takes c6, rook d1 let's say, later on knight a4, knight b6 can be annoying, whereas with the pawn on a7 we have a little bit less play on the queen side. But in this case, very often knight a4 is kind of a multi-purpose move because it also prepares the c5 break at times. So to give you a sample line of how this could look like, knight d7, now he's already protecting against knight a4, so there's not that much point to go for it, but f4 seems to be a legitimate move. And in this case, anyway, knight to a4 since he's attacking our knight. And here we sort of see the plan that I was just describing with queen to c2, c5, and if we manage to play c5, regardless of what he does, pretty much we might have the option of shutting Black's bishop out with e5. So this would be typically the type of position I would like to go for. I think here White has that space advantage and he has relatively easy plans to improve his position, whereas for Black, I always struggled to play these types of positions from the Black side when I went for the Sicilian and got these types of position, and I do think it's quite hard to play still. So rook to c8 therefore is not particularly popular, but it's quite instructive to see how to play against it. Of course, another option for Black in this position would be to take with the rook or with the queen. These types of positions we will also address in some of the future lines, but mostly white wants to go for something like a4, rook c1, rook d1, and then sort of see what black does. But as you can see, we're really controlling the b5 and the d5 break, and that's the most important thing. The main line, however, goes knight to c6, and after castle, black again is at a crossroads. There are several moves here at his disposal. a6 leads to something very familiar to what we just saw, so I would like to address e6 first, because this move obviously aims for the d5 break rather than anything else. Rook to c1 seems to be a healthy way to continue. At this point we don't really have to worry about d5 yet, because after takes, knight takes c6, b takes c6, e5, we see that black actually kind of struggles to find a decent place for his knight. Normally he would like to go knight e8 and maybe follow up with f6, but clearly he's losing an exchange after bishop to c5. Likewise, knight h5 probably isn't the best move, because we can go g4 and win a piece. So it's also important to keep track of the ideas that you have at your disposal when d5 does come, because we cannot always directly prevent it, but often there is some sort of way to use black's pieces, the position of black's pieces. For example, in this case, if the rook was on d8, it was probably possible to go for this variation, as the rook wouldn't be trapped on f8 in this line that I just showed. But in this case, it's not possible yet. So over here, I think the move rook to d8 would be very logical, given the line that we just saw. And I like the move rook e1 here. And again, of course, we're prepared for the move d5, which is kind of the move that black would like to play here. After taking, e5, again, pretty much the only move at black's disposal is the move knight to e8. And now bishop to g5 is kind of an annoying move for black, who would like to keep his rook on d8. And also, whilst attacking the rook, we're actually preventing black from taking the pawn in the future. So after rook b8, I like the move b3. Again, one of those solid moves that you're probably always inclined to make once you start to get a feel for this line. It's a very useful move. And as you can see indicated by arrows, I think after something like knight a4, knight c5, perhaps c takes d5 at the right moment, white's a little bit better. He could also think about rerouting the bishop back to f2, for example. Bishop h4, bishop f2 could be useful to gain more control over those dark squares on the queen side. And once again, I just feel that it's not a spectacular advantage by any means, but it's a space advantage, and we have several squares to aim for, so our play is not that difficult to carry out in this case. Clearly the knight on e8 is misplaced, and putting it on c7 is not really a solution in itself, so black has some real problems here to deal with. Coming back to this position, of course black could also decide not to go for d5 and simply develop by, for example, rook to c8, and here b3. This is a position which was also reached in the game Van Wely against Adams, very similar. So imagine black goes a6 here, knight takes c6, queen takes c6. Really the exact positioning of the pieces here is not extremely important. Once again, this line, as long as you keep track of the fact that black cannot play d5 or b5, it's more about ideas than anything else. So in this case, not the most complicated, but still instructive. Black is obviously aiming to go for b5, so Adams played a4. And here we see one of those situations again where black is struggling to really equalize this by force. So the game continued with b6, rook to e2. This is another idea you want to keep in mind. Once you do reach this sort of stage in which you can start improving your position and you really control those two pawn breaks, it can be useful to put your rook on d2, for example, which puts pressure in the pretty much the most efficient way on d6. Because obviously if your queen is in front of your rooks, you're never really going to be able to take on d6, whereas if you can switch it around, for example by playing rook d2 and maybe later on queen c2, rook d1, the pressure can be a bit more annoying. So the following moves were played: knight to d7, rook d2, queen c7. Another sort of semi-useful move that here you just have time to make, king h1. And after knight c5, bishop to g5, again asking the question whether black really wants to go, for example, f6, which looks quite weakening, or allow some squares to be taken away from his rook. rook d7, knight e2, playing to regroup perhaps the knight back to d4, or sometimes even g3 in combination with f4. This type of position is really what you want to be aiming for as white. And at this point, you really can take some time to try out different plans, because black really doesn't have a way to equalize. So another way I would like to continue here is, for example, bishop to e3 back at some point. And like I indicated, maybe knight g3, f4, f5 could be something interesting. Coming back to the initial position after short castle, that's sort of the play after e6. So again, it's all about controlling black's play. And once you do reach that position in which you sort of, you're better, but it's also hard to continue making plans of your own, it's a matter of practice. It's a little bit of sensing what your opponent wants to do. A lot of players don't like to just sit still and sort of play like Van Bailey played there and keep their position solid. But if black tries to over push it and just do something active at all costs, it can be very easy to win a game due to the fact that black's position is just not very well suited for any action. The main line here, to my mind, is to move a6. And here we're following a game of my own, which is against the Wei Yi. There's another interesting move here, queen d3, which recently was brought to my attention, and I think it's actually a very legitimate try for an advantage as well. I didn't include it as the main line, but I do suggest you to look at it. Several strong grandmasters opted for it and actually got a good position. I liked a4, which is sort of the logical move here once again. After e6, once again we see that move knight takes c6, and here b takes c6 could be played. It was not played in the game, but again, in this case black could argue that because my pawn is on a4, there's a little bit more pressure over the b file, but at the same time the b6 square is a little bit more better guarded, and knight a4, knight b6 could be quite annoying. So a sample line would be, for example, queen to c7, knight a4. So the queen already stepped out of the knight b6 threat, and also now black might be able to play knight d7. Queen d2, protecting the a pawn for the future, and also preparing rook to d1. In this case it didn't make all that much sense to go for rook f2, because black actually struggles to protect the pawn in itself, and the queen does have a pretty good function on d2 in the current pawn structure. And let's say c5 would be a way to stop knight b6 altogether. Rook d1, knight e5, using the fact that c4 is now hanging, so d6 is not really worth taking at this point. But something like this, and knight to b6, looks to me like again a slight advantage for white. And it's actually due to an idea that we've seen earlier, this move bishop to g5. And again, this is one of those ideas that can be very annoying for black if you time it well. As you can see in this case, black is virtually forced to go f6. And this is what I based my my game plan on when I played against a talented player from China, Wei Yi, when I played the move knight takes c6. This is my last game in this variation. He played the move queen takes c6. And here once again, an idea that should be familiar to you right now, queen to d3. Rook to c1 I believe has also been played here, but if I'm not mistaken, black can actually decide to take on c4 in this case, and it might not be that bad. There's some long tactical line involved here, so if you're interested, I suggest you look it up. I believe it goes something like knight to b5 here, but I'm not quite sure. I do know that queen d3 actually offers white a nice little edge, which could also be seen in the game, which continued with knight to d7 once again. And as you can see, the position has a very striking resemblance to that game of Luc van Bailey. I decided to go rook b1 here, which is a little bit conservative, but at the same time I think it's again this position in which black has a really hard time moving. So in the end it didn't matter that much. Black developed with rook d8 and b6. I also went king h1. h6 is quite a clever move in my opinion, because it takes out all these bishop to g5 ideas. I went queen d2, stepping out of any knight e5 or knight c5 ideas and attacking h6. But in this position I decided to immediately exchange the bishops, And I guess this is an important position to briefly discuss because it would be the type of position you're going to encounter in case you basically carried out the previously discussed ideas correctly. So what should I have played here instead? Well, bishop d4 actually still retained some advantage. There wasn't much reason to immediately rush exchanging the bishops because it can be done at any time. Instead, I like the move knight e2. Now in this case, you don't really have to worry about the move b5. I think first of all, white could take and play a5, and he will get a protected pass pawn, which is not really something black is happy about, I imagine. So this is not really a big deal right now. Instead, I think the move knight to c5, for example, could be logical to defend the pawn on d6. There's no longer a counter-attack on the knight there, so black has to defend. And here I like to move h3, which at first seems a little bit unnatural because it might not fit the structure that well. We have a lot of holes on the dark squares. But actually, later on, I think white should at some point try to go for f4 and gain more space on the king side as well. And one example of doing that could be queen to b7 and now bishop to d4. And if we exchange bishops, as you can see, we're really kind of playing around. Now queen to f6 could be annoying, so as a sample line I put in queen to e7. And I like to move knight c3 back. Again, king g8, it's by no means forced, but I just don't really know what black can aim for here. And after f4, I think white should start thinking about regrouping according to something like rook f1, rook f3, at some point maybe a well-timed b4 to bring in another rook, and of course black should always watch out for f5. So once again, it's a matter of taste. These positions require some patience on white's end as well as on black's end, but at the end of the day I really like to play this line because I really think black is very restricted and most players just don't enjoy that sort of position. I do highly suggest looking into the ebook as well and trying to figure out sort of the details. I've pretty much addressed all the ideas here, but it's important to refresh the move orders and all the tricks involved. But as a rule of thumb, I would always suggest that you keep in mind prevent d5 and b5 and try to time knight takes c6 at the right moment, and then you're pretty much good to go. I think the line is at the end of the day a combination of doing that in the right order, and I think it's one of the main reasons that currently the bishop b5 check, bishop d7 line is not that popular and most players go for knight d7. So I hope you enjoyed this video. This is really the fundamental part that you have to know. In the next video we're